Can you hear me now? Oh my god, I had a whole like 5-6 minutes spiel and it was completely blank. Well, good. I can bleep something. I can I accidentally said the beautiful F bomb, so I can I don't have to bleep that now because nobody can hear me. So hi madam, yes, it is not quite a chill reading time because would you believe it or not that this book has been banned in our home state? Not down here, not where we are, but there's a county in Florida that has banned this. Yeah, I am a streamer. So, yeah, I also will be recording this video and uploading it to YouTube. I will be recording the entire book, so as many streams as it takes. But, yeah, I don't know. I've been looking into that. I will, it doesn't, like, all the websites that I've checked doesn't say why it's been banned, other than the fact, I mean, it's cannibalism, but they're zombies. And yet Pride and Prejudice isn't banned. But, I will eventually figure out why it has been banned. But, yeah. So, I'm going to, laugh in the face of all those pearl-clutching mothers of think of the children! Yeah, I am thinking of the children. I'm reading something you didn't want them to. So I will read the blurb in the back because it's kind of funny. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. So begins Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, an expanded edition of the beloved Jane Austen novel featuring all new scenes of bone-crunching zombie mayhem. As our story opens, a mysterious plague has fallen upon the quiet English village of Merton, and the dead are returning to life. Okay, we are back into the part of Ash cannot read English names. Or at least, Old English names. I think this is set in, this is Regency, so not quite Victorian. I think it's like after the Napoleonic War, before the Victorian era. So this is earlier than Sherlock Holmes times. Feisty heroine Elizabeth Bennet is determined to wipe out the zombie menace, but she's soon distracted by the arrival of the haughty and arrogant Mr. Darcy. What ensues is a delightful comedy of manners with plenty of civilized sparring between two young lovers, and even more violent sparring on the blood-soaked battlefield. Can Elizabeth vanquish the spawn of Satan and overcome the social prejudice of the class-conscious landed gentry, complete with romance, heartbreak, sword fights, cannibalism, and thousands of rotting corpses? Pride and Prejudice and Zombies transforms a masterpiece of world literature into something you'd actually want to read. Okay, so it even says in the back, cannibalism. But they're zombies. You kind of expect that of them. Right. Oh, hello. There's a surprise on... Did I... Ah. Someone must have left a bookmark in my copy. Oh, before I even start, hello. I'm a dum-dum. I need to... Oh, I found this taro bubble tea can at my local 7-Eleven. So, more reason for me to visit 7-Eleven because they have all the good stuff. I can probably get it at a local Asian market, but the 7-Eleven's closer. Okay, Chapter 1. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. Never was this truth more plain than during the recent attacks at Netherfield Park, in which a household of 18 was slaughtered and consumed by a horde of the living dead. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is occupied again?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not, and went about his morning business of dagger sharpening and musket polishing, for attacks by the unmentionables had grown alarmingly frequent in recent weeks. "But it is," returned she. Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "Woman, I am attending to my musket. Prattle on if you must, but leave me to the defense of my estate." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear Mrs. Long, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune, that he has escaped London in a chaise and four, just as the strange plague broke through the Manchester line." "What is his name?" "Bingley, a single man of 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." "How so? Can he train them in the ways of swordsmanship and musketry?" "How can you be so tiresome? You must know that I'm thinking of his marrying one of them." "Marriage? In such time as these? Surely this Bingley has no such designs." "Designs? Nonsense! How could you talk so? It is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "Yes, just sit and chill and vibe and enjoy me attempting to read a book for the sake of those who cannot get a hold of it. And for those of you who are listening to this, I am very sorry. I do my best, but I am not a professional. I do this because I love books and I want to read them. I see no occasion for that. And besides, we mustn't busy the roads more than is absolutely necessary, lest we lose more horses and carriages to the unfortunate scourge that has so troubled our beloved Hertfordshire of late. Hertfordshire. But we enjoy it. We are not professionals, but we enjoy it. But consider your daughters. I am considering them, silly woman. I would much prefer their minds be engaged in the deadly arts than clouded with the dreams of marriage and fortune, as your own so clearly is. Go and see this Bingley if you must, though. I warn you that none of our girls has much to recommend them, and they are all silly and ignorant like their mother, the exception being Lizzie, who has something more of the killer instinct than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard of little else these past 20 years of late. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and self-discipline that the experience of 23 years had been insignificant to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. And when she was nervous, she was nearly all the time since the first outbreak of this strange plague in her youth, she sought solace in the comfort of the traditions which now seemed mere trifles to others. The business of Mr. Bennet's life was to keep his daughters alive. The business of Mrs. Bennet's was to get them married. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in carving the Bennet crest in the handle of a new sword, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the next ball." Mrs. Bennet designed not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. You sound as if you have been stricken." "Mother, what a dreadful thing to say with so many zombies about," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Aye, so it is," cried her mother. "And it will be impossible to introduce him, since we shall not know him ourselves. Oh, how I wish I had never heard the name Bingley." "I am sorry to hear that," said Mr. Bennet. "If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky. But as I had actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." To the astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished for. The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished. That of Mrs. Bennet perhaps suppressing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet. But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am. And it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it until now." "Do not mistake my indulgence for a relaxation in discipline," said Mr. Bennet. "The girls shall continue their training as ever, Bingley or no Bingley." Of course," cried Miss Bennet. "They shall be as deadly as they are fetching." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke, he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," said she when the door was shut. "Such joys are scarce since the good Lord saw fit to shut the gates of hell and doom the dead to walk among us. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I'm also the most proficient in the art of tempting the other sex." The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon Mr. Bingley would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Yeah, so far it's definitely sounding very close to the original. Although if I remember correctly, the original probably is a little longer. I have to double check. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced question, ingenious supposition, and distant surmises. But he eluded the skill of all of them, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next ball with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "then all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." "And if I can see all 5 of them survive England's present difficulties, then neither shall I," he replied. In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in the library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty and fighting skills he had heard much, but he only saw the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat, rode a black horse, and carried a French carbine rifle upon his back. Quite an exotic weapon for an Englishman. However, from his clumsy wielding of it, Elizabeth was quite certain that he had little training in musketry or any deadly arts. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the course that was to do. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honor of their invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to retrieve a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted by hearing that instead of 12, he brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the ball, it consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with the air of decided fashion, but little in the way of combat training. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having slaughtered more than 1,000 unmentionables since the fall of Cambridge. Oh my! The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man, and the ladies declared that he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration until his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. And though he lacked Mr. Darcy's proficiency with both sword and musket, such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contract! What a contrast! Mr. Darcy was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, who disliked his general behaviour, was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Mrs. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dances, and during the part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who had come from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join him. "Come, Darcy," he said, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing—" Oh, sorry. Did I say Mr. Darcy? Mr. Bennet. Wow. Okay, let me reread that paragraph again. I am so sorry. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dances. During part of that time, Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough to her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who had come from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join it. "Come, Darcy," he said, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner." I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." "Upon my honour," cried Mr. Bingley, "I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see uncommonly pretty. You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I have ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you who is very pretty, and I dare say agreeable. Which do you mean? And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. As Mr. Darcy walked off, Elizabeth felt her blood turn cold. She had never in her life been so insulted. The warrior code demanded she avenge her honor. Elizabeth reached down to her ankle, taking care not to draw attention. There her hand met the dagger concealed beneath her dress. She meant to follow this proud Mr. Darcy outside and open his throat. But no sooner had she grabbed the handle of her weapon than a chorus of screams filled the assembly hall, immediately joined by the shattering of window panes. Unmentionables poured in, their movements clumsy yet swift, their burial clothing in a range of untidiness. Some wore gowns so tattered as to render them scandalous. Other wore suits so filthy that one would assume they were assembled from little more than dirt and dried blood. Their flesh were in varying degrees of putrefaction. The freshly sickened were slightly green and pliant, whereas the longer dead were gray and brittle. Their eyes and tongues long since turned to dust, and their lips pulled back to everlasting skeletal smiles. A few of the guests who had the misfortune of being too near the windows were seized and feasted on at once. When Elizabeth stood, she saw Mrs. Long struggle to free herself as two female dreadfuls bit into her head, cracking her skull like a walnut and sending a shower of dark blood sprouting as high as the chandeliers. As guests fled in every direction, Mr. Bennet's voice cut through the commotion. Gulls! Pentagram of death! Elizabeth immediately joined her four sisters, Jane, Mary, Catherine, and Lydia, in the center of the dance floor. Each girl produced a dagger from her anchor. They blew. This chapter is a little longer than the others, so I'm gonna need a... Elizabeth immediately joined her four sisters, Jane, Mary, Catherine, and Lydia, in the center of the dance floor. Each girl produced a dagger from her ankle and stood at the tip of an imaginary 5-pointed star. From the center of the room, they began stepping outward in unison, each thrusting a razor-sharp dagger with one hand, the other hand modestly tucked into the small of her back. From the corner of the room, Mr. Darcy watched Elizabeth and her sisters work their way outward, beheading zombie after zombie as they went. He knew of only one other woman in all of Great Britain who wielded a dagger with such skill, such grace, and deadly accuracy. By the time the girls reached the wall of the assembly hall, the last of the unmentionables lay still. And also, hi! We get pictures! Can we see? Yes. Nope. Other way. Damn it. I'm gonna have to move my... on that. We get... there we go. There we go. Okay, so we get pictures in this book. Who knew it was a picture book? Pretty deadly picture. Apart from the attack, the evening altogether passed off pleasantly for the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Yeah. Oh, yes. And when you have 5 daughters, a pentagram is a great way of killing off zombies. They all fight in unison. They all know what to do. They all have their way, their little point of the star. Their father taught them well. I have always loved Mr. Bennet. I remember him being, it even shows in here, the mother is the Roy Wharton. He's just like, yeah. But at the end of the day, he's a good father. I love Mr. Bennet. Apart from the attack, the evening altogether passed off pleasantly for the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough never to be without partners, which was all that they had yet learned to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. Chapter 4. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before... So I have never read this book before, so I don't have any idea of where the sentence structure goes. So hence I will be, repeating myself as I do. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister just how much she admired him. "He is just what a young man ought to be," she said. "Sensible, good-humored, lively, and I never saw such happy manners. So much ease, with such perfect good breeding." "Yes," replied Elizabeth, "but in the heat of battle neither he nor Mr. Darcy were to be found with blade or bludgeon." "Well, I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment." "He certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him, despite his lack of gallantry. You have liked many a stupider person." "Dear Lizzie!" "Oh, you are a great deal too apt, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anyone or anybody. I never heard you speak. Oh God. I dislike this style of writing only just because it sounds so unnatural to modern day, and yet I know this is just how it's written. And there's "Oh, you are a great deal too apt, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in your life. I would not wish to be hasty in censuring anyone. With your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. You like this man's sisters too, don't you? Their manners are not equal to his." They were, in fact, very fine ladies, not deficient in the power of making themselves agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, but knew little of the deadly arts in which she and her own sisters had been so thoroughly trained, both in England and during their trips to the Orient. As for Mr. Bingley himself, between him and Darcy there was a very steady friendship in spite of the great opposition of character. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, and fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually giving offense. But no one, not even Mr. Bingley, knew was the reason behind Darcy's cold demeanor, for until recently he had been the very picture of pleasantry, a young man of merry disposition and utmost attentiveness. But his nature had been forever altered by a betrayal he could not the stomach to speak of. Chapter 5. Within a short, though perilous walk of Longbourn, lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly a maker of fine burial grounds of such stately beauty that the king had seen fit to knight him. He had made a tolerable fortune until the strange plague had rendered his services unnecessary. Few thought it worth the expense to dress the dead in finery, when they would only soil it upon crawling out of their graves. He had removed with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet with civil self-command to Miss Lucas. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed to like his second better." "Oh, you mean Jane. I suppose because he danced with her twice, and because she fought so valiantly against the unmentionables." "Did I not mention that I heard between him and Mr. Robinson?" "Oh, did I not mention what I heard between him and Mr. Robinson? Mr. Robinson asking Mr. Bingley how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think that there were many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest, and his answering immediately to the last question, 'Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet, beyond a doubt. There cannot be two opinions on that point.'" "Upon my word, well, that is very decided indeed." "Mr. Darcy is not too well..." Wow, I have no idea who's talking. "Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he?" said Charlotte. "Poor Eliza, to be called only tolerable! I beg you would not put into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Miss Long told me last night..." Mrs. Bennet's voice failed her at the thought of poor Mrs. Long, her skull crushed betwixt the teeth of those wretched creatures. The ladies sat in silent contemplation for a few moments. "Miss Bingley told me," said Jane finally, "that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintances, with them, he is remarkably agreeable." "His pride," said Miss Lucas, "does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favor, should think so highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud." "That is very true," replied Elizabeth, "and I could easily forgive his pride if he did not mortify mine. I dare say I would have cut his throat had the unmentionables distracted me from doing so." "Pride," observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidarity of her reflections, "is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed." Too many female voices. I can only make so many different ones. Elizabeth could not help but roll her eyes as Mary continued. "Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinions of ourselves. Vanity is what we would have others think of us." At this point, Elizabeth let out a most palpable yawn. Though she admired Mary's bravery in battle, she had always found her a trifle dull in relaxed company. Chapter 6. The ladies of Longbourn soon waited on those of Netherfield. Jane's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and though the mother was found to be intolerable, the younger sisters, not worth speaking to, a wish of being better acquainted with them, was expressed towards the eldest two. By Jane this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth was still saw superciliousness in their treatment of everybody. It was generally evident whenever they met that Mr. Bingley did admire her, and to her it was equally evident that Jane was in a way to be very much in love. But she considered with pleasure that it was not likely to be discovered by the world in general. Elizabeth mentioned this to her friend Miss Lucas. "It may perhaps be pleasant," replied Charlotte, "but it is sometimes a disadvantage to be so very guarded. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more affection than she feels. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her, if she does not help him on." "But she does help him on, as much as her nature will allow. Remember, Charlotte, she is a warrior first, and a woman second." "Well," said Charlotte, "I wish Jane success with all my heart, and if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she had as good a chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12th month. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life." "You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. Remember, Elizabeth, I am not a warrior as you are. I am merely a silly girl of 27 years, and that without a husband." Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attention to his sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she herself was becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend Mr. Darcy. In the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face, then he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes, her uncommon skill with a blade. Oh, and her uncommon skill with a blade. To this discovery succeeded some other equally mortifying. Though he had detected more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing, and her arms surprisingly muscular, though not so much as to diminish her femininity. He began to wish to know more of her, and as a step towards conversing with her himself, attended to her conversations with others. His doing so drew her notice. It was at Sir William Lucas's, where a large party was assembled. "What does Mr. Darcy mean," she said to Charlotte, "by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster?" "That is a question to which Mr. Dawson—" "Wow, Mr. Dawson! Ha! That is a question which Mr. Darcy only can answer." "Well, if he does it any more, I shall certainly let him know that I see what he is about. I have not yet forgiven him for insulting my honor, and may yet have his head upon my mantle." Mr. Darcy approached them soon afterwards. Elizabeth turned to him and said, "Did you not think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now, when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton?" "With great energy, but balls are always a subject which makes a lady energetic." "Well, it depends on who's throwing them, Mr. Darcy." "Well," said Miss Lucas, her face suddenly flushed, "I am going to open the instrument, Elizabeth." "Well," said Miss Lucas, her face suddenly flushed, "I am going to open the instrument, Eliza, and you know what follows." "You are a very strange creature by way of a friend, always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody." Elizabeth's performance was pleasing, though by no means capital. After a song or two, she was eagerly succeeded at the instrument by her sister Mary, who, at the end of a long concerto, joined eagerly in dancing with her younger sisters, some of the Lucases, and 2 or 3 officers at one end of the room. Mr. Darcy stood near them in silent indignation at such a mode of passing the evening, to the exclusion of all conversation, and was too much engrossed by her thoughts to perceive that Sir William Lucas stood beside him, till Sir William thus began. What a charming amusement for young ladies this is, Mr. Darcy." "Certainly so, and it has the advantage also of being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Even every savage can dance. Why, I imagine even zombies could do so with some degree of success." Sir William only smiled, not sure how to converse with so rude a gentleman. He was much relieved at this sight of Elizabeth approaching. "My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I am sure, when so much beauty is before you." He took Miss Bennet's hand and presented it to Mr. Darcy, who was not unwilling to receive it, but she instantly drew back and said with some discomposure to Sir William, "Indeed, sir, I have not the least intention of dancing. I entreat you not to suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner." Mr. Darcy, with grave propriety, requested the honor of her hand, but in vain. Elizabeth was determined. She looked archly and turned away. Her resistance had not injured her with Mr. Darcy, for indeed he was thinking of her with some complacency, and when thus accosted by Miss Bingley, "I can guess at the subject of your reverie." "I should imagine not. You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner. The insipidity, the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all those people, and what I would give to hear your strictures on them." You conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you. My mind was more agreeably engaged. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face, and desired he would tell her what lady had the credit of inspiring such reflections. Mr. Darcy replied, "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet!" repeated Miss Bingley. "Defender of Longbourn, heroine of Hertfordshire! I am all astonishment. You will have a charming mother-in-law indeed, and, of course, the two of you would fill many an unmentionable with your combined proficiencies in the deadly arts." He listened to her with perfect indifference, while she chose to entertain herself in this manner, and his composure convinced her that all was safe. Her wit flowed long. Okay, I'm just gonna... I'm gonna probably have to get another drink. Now, let's see how long I continue. Let's see, where's the... About another 20 pages, okay. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, I might have to actually end this earlier, given the fact that I'm tripping over my own tongue. Okay, yeah, let's cut that down. Okay. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entitled, in default of heirs male, on the distant relationship, and unfortunately for all, was surrounded on all sides by high ground, making it troublesome to defend. Their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton, and had left her 4,000 pounds. She had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father, and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London, where he had earned his letters in science, and where he now owned a pair of factories dedicated to the war effort. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted hither 3 or 4 times a week, despite the unmentionables, which frequently beset travelers along the road, to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop just over the way. The two youngest of the family, Cynthia and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours, and occasionally practice their skills. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a military regiment in the neighborhood. It was to remain the whole winter, wresting coffins from the hardened earth and setting fire to them. Meryton was to be the headquarters. Their visits to Miss Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections, and fresh news from the battlefields of Derbyshire, Cornwall, and Essex, where the fighting was at its fiercest. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave ammunition to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign, and the excited manner in which he spoke of beheading the stricken with a single touch of his sword. After listening one morning to their Thank you. After listening one morning to their effusions on the subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manners of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I had suspected this from some time, but now I am convinced." "I am astonished, my dear," said Miss Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think of your own children silly." "If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it." "Yes, but as it happens, they were all of them very clever. You forget how quickly they became proficient in those oriental tricks you insisted on bestowing them. Being practiced enough to kill a few of the sorry stricken does not make them sensible, particularly when their skills are more often applied for the amusement of handsome officers." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came, and they see them now very often burning the crypts in Shepherd's Hill Cemetery." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note from Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. "Well, Jane, who's it from? What is it about?" "It's from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. For a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this, provided the road is free of the unmentionable menace. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky, given the troubles on the road to Netherfield." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and they spring so easily from the wet earth. I should prefer you have speed at your disposal. Besides, if it rains, you must stay all night." "That would be a good shame," said Elizabeth. if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home. I had much rather go in the coach, said Jane, clearly troubled by the thought of riding alone. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I'm sure. They are all wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are they not? They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them, and too many slaughtered upon the road already. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended to her at the door, with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been long before it rained hard, and the soft ground gave way to scores of the disagreeable creatures, still clad in their tattered finery, but possessing none of the good breeding that had served them so well in life. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane could not come back. This was a lucky idea of mine indeed, said Miss Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note to Elizabeth. My dearest Lizzie, I find myself unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my being set upon by several freshly unearthed unmentionables during my ride to Netherfield. My kind friends will not hear of me returning till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and expecting a few bruises and a minor stab wound. There is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, if your daughter should die, or worse, succumb to the strange plague, it would be more comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley, and under your orders. Oh, I am not afraid of her dying. People do not die of cuts and bruises. She will be taken good care of. People do not die of cuts and bruises. And yet infection is a thing. Okay, I'm sorry. Elizabeth, feeling rather anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and she was no horsewoman. Walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing with so many of them about in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there, assuming you make it alive. You forget that I am a student of Louis of Shaolin, mother. Besides, for every unmentionable one meets upon the road, one meets 3 soldiers. I shall be back by dinner. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted the company, and they set off together, armed only with their ankle daggers. Muskets and katana swords were more efficient means of protecting oneself, but they were considered unladylike, and having no saddle in which to conceal them, the 3 sisters yielded to modesty. If we make haste, said Lydia, as they walked cautiously along, perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes. In Meryton they parted. The 2 youngest repaired to a lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles. During this impatient activity, a bootlace came undone. Not wanting to appear unkempt upon her arrival at Netherfield, she knelt down to tie it. There was suddenly a terrible shriek, not unlike that which hogs make when being butchered. Elizabeth knew at once what it was, and reached for her ankle dagger most expeditiously. She turned, blade at the ready, and was met with a regrettable visage of 3 unmentionables, their arms outstretched and mouths agape. The closest seemed freshly dead, his burial suit not yet discolored, and his eyes not yet dust. He lumbered toward Elizabeth at an impressive pace, and when he was but an arm's length away from her, she plunged the dagger into his chest and pulled it skyward. The blade continued upward, cutting through his neck and face until it burst through the very top of his skull. He fell to the ground and was still. The second unmentionable was a lady, and much longer dead than her companion. She rushed at Elizabeth, her clawed fingers swaying clumsily about. Elizabeth lifted her skirt, disregarding modesty, and delivered a swift kick to the creature's head, which exploded in a cloud of brittle skin and bone. She, too, fell, and was no more. The third was unusually tall, and though long dead, still possessed a great deal of strength and quickness. Elizabeth had not yet recovered from her kick when the creature seized her arm and forced the dagger from it. She pulled free before he could get his teeth on her, and took to the crane position, which she thought appropriate for an opponent of such height. The creature advanced, and Elizabeth landed a devastating chop across its thighs. The limb broke off. The unmentionable fell to the ground, helpless. She retrieved her dagger and beheaded the last of her opponents, lifting its head in the air and letting her battle cry be known for a mile in every direction. Elizabeth found herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shown into the breakfast parlor, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles with so many unmentionables about in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Miss Hurst and Miss Bingley. Well, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness. There was good humor and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasion justifying her to take the great risk of coming alone, with nothing but a dagger between her and death. The latter was only thinking of his breakfast. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favorably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth attended her, silently worrying that her beloved sister had caught the strange plague. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself, when she saw how much affection and solitude they showed for Jane. The apothecary came, and having examined his patients, said, much to relief of all, that she had caught no strange plague, but a violent cold, no doubt from doing battle in the rain. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage. When Jane testified such concern in parting with her, Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer to an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present. Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and the servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring back a supply of clothes, and at Elizabeth's request, a favorite musket. Okay, and then I will end this with yet another drawing. This one of the battle. And I think there's another reason why it got banned, because that, wait, there we go. There's a dead body with his head open, and that's all its glory. There we go. Damn it, there we go. There we go. There's the bloody body with its head split open. And then, there we go, there's more fighting. I'll have to learn how to do this better. But, yep. Okay. That is chapters 1 through 7 of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I hope you enjoyed. I will continue this next week. I live stream these on Wednesdays, usually starting around 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And I will probably be uploading these either shortly after or Fridays. Maybe give or take 2 weeks later. But, yep. I will see you next time. Thank you for coming. Have a great afternoon. Bye.